All right, I'd like to carry on then with infectious diseases. These are covered beginning on page 466 in your book. And we're going to cover some of the historically, some historically important infectious diseases. But first you need some definitions. So here is one. Pathogen. I've given you this definition before, but what is a pathogen? A pathogen is an organism that causes disease. Pathogens cause disease. So what's a vector then? A vector is an organism that carries a disease. For instance, the Anopheles mosquito is the vector for malaria. It's not the organism that causes malaria. That pathogen is called Plasmodium vivax. But vector is the bite of the mosquito. You need to know the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic. Pan means worldwide or universal. So epidemics are areas of acute disease in a relatively small area, and pandemics are diseases spread all around the world. And here are the diseases that we'll talk about. I have some diagrams for some of these. Well, let's start with plague. You've all heard of it before, the Black Death. Bubonic plague. Bubonic plague's been responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths in the world during the course of its existence. The organism, the pathogen that causes the plague, is called Yersinia pestis. Not that you need to know that, but it's a bacteria that's pretty easy to deal with. I mean, around the world, plague still pops up as a disease in humans, but it's highly controlled by antibiotics. So now that we have those, we don't have to have half of the world's population being killed in 100 years as happened in the 1300s. The vector for plague is mice. Rats and mice will carry this bacteria, and then if humans live in close contact with them, a bite of a rat, or perhaps even eating a rat and not cooking it properly, can end up with humans being infected with Yersinia pestis. Malaria, again, the organism is called Plasmodium, and there's more than one species. And that Plasmodium, part of its life cycle is to be in the stomach of the Anopheles mosquito. And you're probably aware that when a mosquito bites you, it actually vomits. So the stomach contents of the mosquito, when it bites you, are regurgitated into the hole that the mosquito makes when it bites you. And now the Plasmodium organism can get into your bloodstream. Tuberculosis, I've mentioned before. TB is a bacteria. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the name of the bacteria, and it is a lung infection. The reason that we're so careful about tuberculosis is Mycobacterium is a particularly hard bacteria to kill because part of its life cycle includes a capsule. So this organism has a capsule which makes it resistant to a lot of antibiotics and resistant to some of our common everyday cleaning techniques that are supposed to rid a desktop or something like that from a bacteria. For instance, it's resistant to chlorine. And then measles. Measles is a virus. So let's go through my graphics here on this. Here is the malaria diagram, and it kind of shows you the life cycle here. And you can see again, it's the Anopheles mosquito. The Anopheles mosquito is the vector, and the organism, the Plasmodium gametocyte, finds itself in the mosquito, and then with the mosquito bites the human and ingests the blood, the Plasmodium organism can get into the human. Once the parasite invades the blood cells, and that's what it does, I mean, the diagnosis for this disease is finding these little parasites inside your red blood cells. It's really the only way to tell what's making you sick. And the person that gets sick has a wide variety of problems. Mostly it's lethargy, no energy whatsoever, sweats, high fever, and joint pain. So these are the things, but that's pretty non-specific. I mean, a lot of diseases give you symptoms like those. So it's only after you find the parasite inside the red blood cells that you can diagnose the person with malaria. And I believe that I've actually shown you a blood smear of red blood cells that are infected with the organism.
Malaria is an ancient disease caused by a blood-borne parasite called the Plasmodium protozoa that infects and then destroys red blood cells. Symptoms include fever, shaking chills, headache, and muscle ache. It is spread by the female Anopheles mosquito. The mosquito injects the malaria-causing parasites into the bloodstream of a human host. The parasites make their way to the liver, where they reproduce into a different form. They then re-enter the bloodstream. In the bloodstream, the new parasites infect red blood cells and reproduce into two forms. The cell eventually bursts, releasing the new parasites. One form of the parasite continues to infect more blood cells. The other form of the parasite is ingested by another mosquito that bites the human victim. Inside the mosquito, the parasite reproduces, and the new parasites are ready to infect another victim. Malaria was almost eliminated during the 1950s and 1960s. Mosquitoes were killed with insecticides such as DDT, and people were given anti-malarial drugs such as quinine. Since the 1970s, malaria has made a comeback because mosquitoes and parasites became genetically resistant to the insecticides and drugs used against them. The disease now infects more than 300 million people worldwide every year and kills more than 3 million of those infected.
So you can see there are a lot of deaths associated with malaria, and that's why it's such a big deal around the world. Now, why don't we have a problem with malaria? Simple. This Anopheles mosquito is not found in climate like ours. All right, it's found in tropical climates. So if you're going to an area that's closer to the equator, sometimes you'll be given anti-malarial drugs ahead of time to protect you, even if you are bitten by the Anopheles mosquito, to protect you from having the sporozoites of the Plasmodium be able to attack your red blood cells. And this is why climate change is an issue, because if we warm, that means that band on either side of the equator might enlarge, and the Anopheles mosquito might be able to live in increasingly high latitudes, both north and south. And if that occurs, then we might see the Anopheles mosquito in our country. If we do, then we run the risk of malaria. Okay, and here's the deal. It's endemic, which means found all the time in more than 100 countries. And notice, as I said, notice the where the equator is. Let me draw it for you here. The equator is right about here, isn't it? It is. The equator is right about here. So places to the north and places to the south. And again, if warming continues, then we start to have the problem of temperatures that are usually look like around here end up being the temperatures around here, and then you get to a place where you might be able to see a Anopheles mosquito in our country. Tuberculosis in the United States. Good news is we've done a pretty good job of controlling tuberculosis. It's very infectious, and like I said, that bacterium is rather hard to kill. So the number of cases is declining rapidly from the 50s and the 60s as we've gotten way better at diagnosing and treating it, and deaths are way down because we've gotten very good at dealing with tuberculosis. And yet, we still concern ourselves. And if you could see this past 2010, you would see a slight uptick here in TB cases here in the United States. That's tuberculosis. Here it is around the world, and you can see that tuberculosis is much more of a problem. I'm going to stop this now and fix this key right here for you. Hang on a second. There we go. Now we can see what we're talking about here. So deaths of tuberculosis, not much in the developed countries. You know, here's Australia. The developed countries of the world are in good shape. Europe, but then things start to get, and then even this part of Europe here in Eastern Europe, not so bad. But let's look at the reds and the maroons, and you can see it's the developing countries. It's Africa. It's places that have poor hygiene, and they have no access to the medications that they need to help protect them. I put this slide in here just to give you an idea of the size of different organisms that we talk about here. Of course, all of these are microscopic. Viruses are generally way smaller than bacterial organisms. Viruses, of course, are not truly living things because they cannot reproduce on their own. In fact, we don't call it viral reproduction. We call it viral replication. It's so simple, but it requires DNA of another organism. So that's why viruses are really not characterized as living things. You have something as small as 1 micrometer in size, and then we see Ebola is a very odd looking virus. Here's the AIDS virus, hepatitis, you get the idea. This diagram here is on a scale of 6 micrometers. So this is basically 6 times bigger. This is 6 times bigger than this one is. And we can see the organism that causes cholera is called Vibrio cholerae, and it is a rod-shaped organism, and it is motile. It can move because it's got a flagella. Here is the syphilis organism. It's called Treponema pallidum. It's a corkscrew-shaped bacterium. And then here is the one that causes tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. If you had a better picture of this, you would see a capsule all around the outside of this bacillus, this rod-shaped bacterium, and that's what makes it hard to deal with. And then here's our malarial friend, Plasmodium falciparum. This is a 10 micrometer picture. This is the form of the organism that's found in your bloodstream. The cystic form is a little round dot, as you saw in that video. That's the one that's found inside your red blood cell. You've seen pictures of viruses before. Basically, a virus is 2 parts. It's genetic material, and then it's surrounded by a protein coat. And there's the surface proteins. And viruses replicate by needing a host cell. And once the virus gets into the host cell, that's when all the fun happens. Because this virus needs some other organism to produce DNA for it. So the viral genetic material uses the host cell's DNA to make more viruses. So then there's a whole bunch of viral DNA inside of the bacterium. The protein coat forms around that DNA, and so now inside of this cell is many, many viruses. And of course, eventually they will break the host cell, destroy the cell, and go on to replicate inside of other cells. So what are our solutions to problems? One of the things we need to do is focus in on where all the freaking people are. We know the poor countries of the world, the LEDCs, are in Africa and South America, all along the equator. So we need better research into tropical diseases and vaccines. If you're ever interested in medicine, to specialize in tropical diseases would be a very worthwhile specialty for you. If you reduce poverty and malnutrition, the ability of these people to get sick would decrease by a lot. If you eat well, your body is more robust and able to fight off an infection. Reducing poverty makes it easier for people to be able to get the food that they need. Improve the drinking water. A lot of these diseases are spread by drinking bad water. We see this a lot, unfortunately. Because we use antibiotics a little too indiscriminately, we end up inadvertently creating a mutation in the bacteria that is resistant to that antibiotic. And of course the list goes on here. That's how we deal with infectious diseases. I hope you enjoyed those. We have 5 new diseases that I'd like to cover, and I'll cover that in another video here coming up. So why don't we do that? Why don't we stop now? No, you know what? I don't think I'm going to stop now. I'm going to continue on and hit these diseases. I don't need to talk to you much about HIV/AIDS. You've probably learned all about it already in other courses. But I'll just say, you know, it's still a contagious disease and very strong in the developing worlds. So is Ebola. Ebola is a bacteria. And it's found in Africa. Death occurs within 2 weeks with the, it's a virus with the Ebola virus. Mad cow disease, the story of that disease is that they found a virus that was inside cows in England back in the mid-90s, and that was a mutated virus, and it usually doesn't jump to humans, but there was a big concern because one of the practices in England was to ground up, you know, dead beef parts. I'm trying to say this as nice as I can. Ground up beef parts and feed them to cows. And so they were cows were ingesting this deadly virus. If you ingest the cow that has the virus, you can become infected. The number of human infections of mad cow disease is really, really small. It was never a big thing. Bird flu. Bird flu is a problem that showed up in Spain. It's called the Spanish bird flu. The H1N1 virus was responsible for bird flu. And then we have the West Nile virus, this is ours. This is a virus that we discovered here in the United States, spread by the bite of a mosquito. And it was first discovered in New York State and spread quickly throughout the Northeast region. And today we have West Nile virus cases in all 50 states. So here are all the different ones. Lyme disease was another one we did not mention. Lyme disease is a virus that's spread by the bite of a deer tick. So if you happen to get the deer tick on your skin and it bites you, you can come down with Lyme disease. Here's the H5N1 bird flu. That is the bird flu that became famous in Asia. That happened in your lifetime, the spread of this bird flu, because this virus ended up being in a person or people, and they got on a plane and flew to the U.S. and brought the virus with them, and they actually quarantined the plane for a while because they discovered that somebody was on there was sick and had H5N1. Dengue fever, sometimes you hear it called dengue fever. Dengue fever Another disease that you see on the AP exam a lot, they talk about this particular disease. They don't ask you to identify what it is or what causes it, but just that you be aware that it's one of these emergent diseases. And again, look at where this disease is found primarily. The equatorial region. Now there is some area here in India and Pakistan. Yellow fever, almost exclusively in the equatorial region. And why are all these diseases in the equatorial region? Because the virus is spread by the bite of an insect. Insect bites are much more common in warm tropical areas. All right, now I am going to stop for sure, and we're going to get into chemical risks next. That whole first two videos there was just about diseases. Let's talk about chemicals coming up next. Bye for now.